Okay, well, why don't we just pick up from right there? Our topic for today is Proverbs 10 through 12, righteousness, justice, and equity. Let me remind you that when we first started looking at the book of Proverbs, we saw that in the third verse of Proverbs chapter 1, that one of the purposes of wisdom was to produce righteousness, justice, and equity. So what that means, again, is that the book of Proverbs is not merely about communicating knowledge or wisdom, divine perspective, but it's also about producing a certain kind of behavior. And that behavior has as its core ethical virtues, righteousness, justice, and equity. Let me just be clear what I mean by ethical virtues. So if we think in terms of right and wrong, we're thinking in terms of ethics. That which is in harmony with Yahweh and pleasing to Yahweh is what is right. That which is contrary to Yahweh or an abomination to him is what is wrong. So righteousness, justice, and equity are three key terms that highlight the essential ethical character that Proverbs is intending to produce in its audience, whether that is the young person or the wise and the understanding who, like verse 5 says, the wise man will hear and increase. A man of understanding will inquire wise counsel. So there's really no limit to our ability to grow in virtue. Now, since Yahweh is the standard for virtue in Scripture, to be virtuous is to be godly. To be virtuous is to be holy. That is, these two categories would overlap when it comes to that area of moral right and wrong. The key term that Solomon uses is righteousness, justice, and equity. And we saw that just here in verse 3 of chapter 1. Now, let me remind you that we saw that in chapter 9 that Solomon said, let me just remove some of my highlighting here to give us a little clearer path to work with. So the first 4 verses of chapter 2 give the if you seek wisdom, then you discern the fear of the Lord. Verse 9, then you discern. And notice, again, our key word there, you discern, our key words, righteousness, justice, and equity. So chapter 2 tells us that the search for wisdom leads to Yahweh, leads to a right relationship with Him, described as the fear of Yahweh and the knowledge of God, and the ability then to discern how to behave in ways that are righteous, just, and equitable. Now, let me just pause and ask the question, what does it mean to be righteous? What's the definition of righteousness? And I want to answer that question by talking about how to do word studies in the Old Testament for just a minute, or the New Testament for that matter. But the bottom line is, when we approach a word, we want to look at all of its uses. The most frequent way it is used will be considered its normal meaning. That is, if a word is used very commonly in one way and then not so commonly in another way, that common meaning will be considered the normal meaning of the word, and it will only be contextual factors that will tell us that the word has other meanings. When we talk about theological words like the word righteousness or justice or ethical terms like equity, then we have an additional factor to consider. That is, when God revealed His word Himself to His people, He did not hand a vocabulary list down from heaven to help His people know what the words that He was using meant. Rather, God chose to use the language that He had already created and was in existence, of course, with Adam and Eve, and then ultimately after the Tower of Babel, as He divided the languages of men and dispersed humanity. He has chosen to make use of words and word meanings that already exist in the languages that He's revealing Himself, whether that's Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek. Since God uses already existing meanings, then the best way to get at the meaning of theological terms is to start by asking, is this word ever used in non-theological contexts? That is, in ordinary usage, that's not talking about God or heaven or a particular religious concept. And work then from that ordinary meaning to its usage in theological language. So let me give you an illustration of that. And with this word righteousness. So the word righteousness that occurs in Proverbs shows up in the Old Testament in a large number of locations. In fact, I think the total number of occurrences for the righteousness word group is well over 150. But when we look for instances where the word righteous or righteousness occurs in non-theological contexts, we find that in Leviticus 19 and in Deuteronomy 25, that, let's see, I may have actually gotten those backwards. Deuteronomy 19. I will hang on a sec while I pull this up, and I will show you what I'm doing as I look here at BibleWorks. Oops, wrong. There we go. That's what I wanted. Yes, Leviticus 19. Let's see. Verse 36. Yes, this is the verse that I was looking for. In Leviticus 19:36, we read these words. You shall have, let's see here. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, Leviticus 19 is, of course, the key chapter in the Holiness Code in the book of Leviticus that connects holiness to human behavior. And Leviticus 19 starts with verse 2, which says, you shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy, a key text that Peter quotes in 1 Peter 1:15 and 16. And then the whole rest of the chapter outlines what's involved in being holy, and a key element of that, toward the end of the chapter, is the way in which you conduct your business, specifically your agricultural business of weighing, measuring, and transacting interactions between people. And the word translated righteous in Proverbs shows up here to describe balances, weights, ephahs, and hin. So measurement. The word shows up as well in Deuteronomy 25 and verse 15. Similarly, it says, you shall have a full and a righteous or just weight. You shall have a full and just measure, that your days may be prolonged in the land which Yahweh your God gives you. So let's think for a moment. What do we know about weights and measures? Well, if a weight is a full weight, then that would mean that if it says it's a gallon, it's actually a gallon and not less than or more than a gallon. If it says it's a pound or a kilogram, it would be exactly that amount, not more or not less. So by looking at the way the word righteous is used in reference to ordinary weights and measures, we can conclude that a thing is righteous if it meets the standard that is in view. The standard for a hin, the standard for a measure, the standard for a weight. The standard may change depending on what we're talking about, but whatever the standard is, if the balance, the measure, the weight meets that standard, then it is righteous. So that's the ordinary use of the word righteous in the Old Testament. Now, what would that mean in a theological context? Well, in a theological context, then God or His Word or some command that God has given would be the standard, and to be righteous would be to meet up to that standard. So, to be righteous is to measure up to the standard that Yahweh has in place. The context will specify. It may be as broad as Yahweh's character itself or as narrow as a particular command that Yahweh has given. So, when we're studying words, particularly theological terms, we want to look at the non-theological uses of the word before we look at the theological uses. We're always open to theological usage and context to add to or shape our understanding of that word, but we need a starting place. And I could illustrate this with the word holy or any other theological term that we use. So with that background, I want to come back to Proverbs chapter 2. So we're going to discern what is righteousness. That is, we're going to discern what is in harmony with the standard that Yahweh has set. The word justice is a word that's used in law court when a judge declares that a person is guilty who is actually guilty, or declares a person innocent who is actually innocent, then they have done justice. So justice is really righteousness applied to the domain of courtroom decisions. When we make a judicial decision that is in harmony with the standard that Yahweh has set, and that standard is to declare the innocent righteous and to declare the guilty, then we have done justice. The word equity occurs relatively infrequently and seems to have the basic idea of straightness. Well, what is straightness except measuring up to a particular standard? That is, the standard of not being crooked, but being what we call straight. So there is behavior that wisdom wants us to be able to discern, that is, to make determinations about what is right versus wrong, what is right and wrong, particularly in the realm of judicial deliberations. And of course, that's not just the official or technical courtroom. We talk about the court of public opinion. We talk about weighing things and making judgments and justice in our mind. So all the dimensions of that activity would be included as well. And equity, choosing paths, choosing actions that are straight and right as they should be. All right, so I've tried to give you a introduction to the words righteousness, justice, and equity. I've shown you that it is introduced in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 3, that it shows up again in Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 9 as one of the consequences of the pursuit of wisdom. And now I want to take us to chapter 10, because in chapters 10 and 10, 11, and 12, we have a great deal of Proverbs. Those three chapters, 10, 11, and 12, those chapters have the highest occurrence or frequency of the words righteousness, justice, and equity of anywhere in the book of Proverbs. I'm going to display this full screen this way so that I can mark on my slides here with my cursor. So a total number of 16 occurrences of these terms. My search here is based on the Hebrew vocabulary, but I'm displaying the English words for us. 16 is the highest occurrence, and that occurs in Proverbs chapter 11 itself. Proverbs chapter 10 comes in second with 14 instances of those terms, and Proverbs 12 is third with 12 instances. You can see, if I draw a line down my slide, that those three chapters stand out as the mountain peaks in the book of Proverbs where these three terms occur. The next closest is down here in chapter 21 with 10 occurrences of those terms. So, because there's such a high frequency of these terms in these three chapters, I believe that Solomon has intentionally located this theme in chapters 10 and 12 to match the language of chapter 2, verse 9, that when you seek wisdom, then you discern righteousness, justice, and equity, and every good path, and that chapters 13 and following are intentionally mirroring the language of every good path that we find in chapter 2, verse 9. In other words, chapter 2 itself is kind of a map for the way that Proverbs 10 through the rest of the book is laid out. Now, not only do the terms righteousness, justice, and equity occur frequently, but I want to notice that the word wickedness, which is an antonym for righteousness, also occurs very frequently. So I'm not very good drawing with my mouse, but you can see here that Proverbs 10, 11, and 12 have a total in each of the chapters and a total together that significantly elevates their uses of the word wickedness above other chapters in Proverbs. Again, chapter 21 is your next closest instance. So what these statistics tell me is that there's clearly a thematic focus on righteousness, justice, and equity in Proverbs 10 through 12. This has been recognized by scholars widely. And that leads to the question of, well, how should we study a theme like this? We are in the sentence literature of Proverbs in chapters 10 and following, as opposed to the speech literature that we saw in chapters 1 through 10, or lecture. And so we don't have in chapters 10 and following the kind of sequential logic of ideas being laid out in sequential steps Instead, we have what's often felt to me like kind of a box of buttons. And you reach in, and there's no connection. All of these loose buttons are. What do you do with all these things? Well, I'm wanting to offer you this morning a way to study the sentence Proverbs. I'm going to use chapters 10 through 12 as an example and walk you through the inductive study steps. These are steps I've taken myself in my study of chapters 10 to 12 to seek to understand what Yahweh is revealing about himself and about his righteousness and what that means for how he wants me to live. So, the very first step in an inductive study would be to highlight the key terms. Highlight the key term. So, let's see. If we come over to Proverbs 10, I would encourage you on your copy of Proverbs to use a colored pencil or an electronic program like I've got here, PDF Exchange Editor, that allows me to mark up PDFs, and go through Proverbs chapters 10, 11, and 12 and mark all instances of the word righteousness and or righteous. Okay, so righteousness, of course, is the condition of being righteous, and righteous is measuring up to the standard. And as you go through, you will start to see clearly how frequently the idea of righteous or righteousness shows up in these chapters. Okay, so by highlighting the key terms, we can then get a clear feel for the frequency of the theme, the distribution of the theme, and then we can start doing a study of, and that would be my second step over here, to identify the key traits associated with that theme. What are the consequences of righteousness? What are the benefits of righteousness? What are the characteristics of the righteous person or of righteousness? And so let's see, didn't mean to do that. Righteous person. Now, I think you can see just by my going through the text and highlighting the words righteous or righteousness where they occur, that we have a lot of instances in just chapter 10 itself. Okay. Now, once you've done that, you could pull together a description of the righteous person or the righteous man in Proverbs 10, 11, and 12. And that would provide you a picture of the characteristic behaviors, thought processes, words, attitudes, and consequences that mark a righteous person. Just for example, by looking here, we see that there's a special relationship in between Yahweh and a righteous person, that Yahweh says he will not allow the righteous person to hunger, but he rejects the cravings of wicked men. Now, the word translated hunger here normally means to starve, and was used in Deuteronomy chapter 8 to describe the children of Israel after they'd gone into the wilderness for 3 days without food. And Yahweh then provided the manna. So this verse does not mean that Yahweh does not allow righteous people to experience the physical feeling of hunger, nor does it mean that he will not allow them to go without food for some time. The point seems to be that Yahweh, as a general rule, commits himself to providing for the food of those who are in right relationship with him. And of course, Jesus says this same thing, that your heavenly Father knows that you have need of food and clothes, and he's committed himself to provide that for you. Now, once again, let's remind ourselves, Proverbs makes generalizations. It doesn't make absolute statements. So has there ever been a righteous person who starved to death? Well, yes, there's evidence that there have been people who starved to death because of the wickedness of their enemies or other adverse circumstances that were outside the bounds of their control. But as a general principle, is it true that Yahweh provides for the food of those who are in right relationship with him? Yes, it is. And he expects us to trust him to do that. Now, blessings are on the head of a righteous man. So being righteous is something I would want because I want to be blessed. It talks about the memory of a righteous man. So it's not merely blessings on his head, but other people view him as someone to be thankful or grateful for. Then we start to see the mouth of the righteous man, the tongue of the righteous, the lips of the righteous, the hope of the righteous, the mouth and lips. So just by scanning down through the terms that I see associated with the righteous man, I see there's a pattern of Proverbs talking about the tongue or lips or mouth of the righteous person. And so that means that one of the key characteristics of the righteousness that Yahweh wants us to be able to discern is a certain kind of speech. And then we could look at that in particular and say, oh, well, that what we've got here is a mouth that is a fountain of life, as opposed to violent words. The tongue is of choice silver, so clearly the things that are said are valuable. A righteous man is known for speaking words that add values. In modern language, he's a value adder. The lips of the righteous person feed many. Okay, so are the words that I speak words that are spiritually nourishing? So clearly it's not talking about material food, since we're talking about the immaterial aspect of one's words. But do the words that I speak build other people up? The righteous man's mouth flows with wisdom. Okay, so now we have a connection between righteousness and wisdom. We've seen this connection before. But someone who is righteous in the sense that Proverbs is discussing is a person whose mouth is filled with words that reflect the perspective of Yahweh, that help people to see beyond the surface appearance of things to the real nature of things, and so on. So this would be the start of an inductive study of the terms righteousness, justice, and equity. But there's more that to such a method. And the third step that I have listed here is to trace out synonyms and corollaries. Of course, I know that you know what a synonym is. It's words that have similar meanings. And the easiest way to do this is to look for places where you have the righteous and another term of virtuous. So take a look, for example, here in Proverbs 11:5. So the righteousness of upright men and the righteousness of a blameless man. So we now have here two synonymous terms, not synonymous in the sense that they mean exactly the same thing, but synonymous in the sense that they're in the same basic category of being virtuous. That these terms will help us fill out our understanding of what it means to be righteous, just, and equitable. Because now that we know that a righteous man is a blameless man, any place else that Proverbs talks about the blameless man, or it talks about the upright man, now I know that I'm in the same category. I don't have discrete categories. I have this large category of righteousness, and a subset of that is a blamelessness and uprightness. And by paying attention to those synonyms, we see that it's not just the verses in Proverbs 10, 11, and 12 that have the word righteousness in them that are talking about righteousness, but in fact, there are additional places in the chapter that are addressing the same theme. Now, a corollary would be where two ideas or concepts or items occur together. So, in Proverbs, we don't often see the words wisdom or wise in the same verse with the words righteousness or righteous. But we did see that the mouth of a righteous man flows with wisdom back in chapter 10, verse 31. And that means that there's a correlation between righteousness and wisdom. And we could say that wisdom and righteousness are corollaries, so that when we see a proverb about a wise man, we're also seeing a proverb about a righteous man, and vice versa. When we see one about a righteous man, we're getting a description of the wise person. So, in my mind, I think, let's think, for example, of righteousness as the largest circle, and then within that circle we have additional things, and we have multiple overlapping concepts that are going to show up in Proverbs, much like this. And maybe righteousness is the largest circle, and blamelessness and uprightness would be smaller circles within that. Or I'm not trying to illustrate the relative frequency by the size of the circle I've drawn. I'm just trying to help you think of these concepts as overlapping, as not separated or unrelated to one another. Okay. I haven't gotten any questions yet about what I've been saying, and we're at 10:06. We're about 10 minutes away from our stopping point. I have one point left on my slide for doing inductive study, and that is to trace out antonyms. And I pointed toward that with this slide that I had on wickedness. That is, righteousness and wickedness are opposites in the Old Testament. So if righteousness is measuring up to a standard, then wickedness is failing to measure up to that standard. And wickedness, although in English the word wicked generally means someone who is, or something, some action that is very bad, that it's an intense degree of bad. In Hebrew, that is not the case. And that's not the case in Scripture. That is, that anybody, anything, any action that is not in harmony with the standard that Yahweh sets can be described as wicked. Just means it doesn't measure up to the standard. I recently had my oldest son come to me with a question from the book of Ecclesiastes, where there's a verse that's very puzzling to many people. Another reason why people tend to avoid Ecclesiastes. It says, don't be over righteous and don't be over wicked. You're like, what? How can you be too righteous and you're not supposed to be too wicked? You mean just be a little wicked? Well, that is a very perplexing statement given our English understanding of these terms. But once you understand that righteousness simply means to measure up to a standard, and wickedness means to not measure up to a standard, then you can see how it would be possible for this proverbial statement that Solomon makes in the book of Ecclesiastes to not be talking about measuring up to the standard of Yahweh's word, but being rigid and inflexible. So don't be over-righteous, that is, don't have no give or flex or flexibility in your character or thinking. If you do that, you come to harm. And don't be so inflexible as to be erratic. That would be to be over wicked. So variable as to have no consistency. When we went to China, one of the proverbs that we learned for going to China was, blessed are the flexible, for they shall not break. A great deal of flexibility is needed when you operate in a second or third world country. And so the question is, where does willfulness come in? Wickedness would seem to imply a willful refusal to measure up. Actually, that's not the case. If you look at all the uses of wickedness in Scripture, you'll see that any deviation from the standard will count as wickedness, whether it's intentional or unintentional, whether the standard in view is even moral. That is, you can be wicked. The Hebrew word rasha. So let me say it. Let me just use that word. You can be rasha in non-ethical ways. Okay, and I was trying to illustrate that by talking about this verse in Ecclesiastes where it says, "Don't be too rasha." I think the proper understanding of that passage is, don't be so flexible that there's no consistency, and don't be so inflexible that there's no flexibility. Understanding that the words righteous and wicked can be used in non-theological senses, as I already showed from the weights and the measures, is really helpful in working with some of these texts that might at first glance seem to be advocating for some kind of moral relativism. Now, please don't hear me saying that the word wicked can't ever be used of willful deviation from Yahweh's standard. Well, of course it can. In fact, that's probably its most frequent use. So the wicked person in Proverbs is someone who turns aside from doing what is right. They're making a choice. There's no question about that. But if we embed that willfulness in the basic idea of the word, we will misread various places where it's used. It depends on the context whether that willfulness is in view or not. Now, my point in talking about wickedness here for the inductive study step was to note that there are going to be verses in Proverbs 10 through 12 that don't use the word righteousness, but they use the word wickedness. So let's just find a quick example of that. Let's see it this way. So here's an example. Proverbs 11:7. When a wicked man dies, his expectation will perish, and the hope of strong men perishes. Now, on the surface, this is just a statement about the wicked. But because we know that wicked is an antonym for righteous, we can then say that this is also teaching us something about the righteous. By implication, when a righteous man dies, his expectation does not perish. Okay? The hope of strong men may perish. It's various ways of translating that last phrase. There's not agreement among the translations. But my point here is that we can say, oh, I can learn something about righteousness by paying attention to where the word wicked occurs, even if the word righteous isn't there. Let's see. Now, sometimes wicked's going to be paralleled with other positive terms. This is a good example. Proverbs 10:27. The fear of Yahweh adds days, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. So here we have a contrast between fearing Yahweh and being wicked. So we can conclude then that the wicked are those who do not fear Yahweh. And since those who do fear Yahweh are not wicked, they must be righteous. And that is, to fear Yahweh is to be righteous. And now we're bringing corollaries, synonyms, into our range of view and see, oh, okay, so the fear of the Lord, righteousness, upright, faithful, blameless, is a whole set of terms that's describing the character of the person that is wise. And in contrast to that, there's another set of terms, the wicked, the faithless, the deceitful, the unfaithful. These will be the opposite. Well, I haven't spent a lot of time commenting on particular verses in Proverbs 10 through 12, but rather on the concept of doing a subject study. I hope that as you make use of the steps that I have outlined here for you on this slide, that your own appreciation of what it means to be righteous has deepened and broadened, and that your reading of Proverbs 10 through 12 will be less like running your hand through a box of disconnected buttons, but you'll start to see the interconnected and interwoven nature of the theme that pervades these 3 chapters. I trust you have a good day. May the Lord bless you.